Most crime, including murder and sexual assault, is done by men. Are men toxic? Are they inherently violent and inferior to women? These are some of the questions we're going to try to answer in this edition of The Commonwealth Matters. Hi, I'm Richard Nelson, your host. Joining us to talk further is Professor Nancy Pearcey, author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Professor Pearcey is a professor and a scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today and hailed in the Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Nancy, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I have your book here in hand, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and I read a lot of books. This is part of my job. I'm not always sure what I'm getting into, but I do need to say that you have quite a book here. Didn't know what to expect. Very impressed by it. And I'd like to cover some of the main points, some of the high points in your book that really it would take several programs, and we don't have time to do that. But I'm going to start out with this idea that there is a toxic war on masculinity. You say early on in your book that according to one media researcher, in his analysis of 2,000 mass media portrayals of men, he found that 75% of men were portrayed as villains, aggressors, perverts, and philanderers. This didn't happen in a vacuum, did it? So here's the question. How did we get to this place where men today are vilified in popular culture as being toxic?
Well, yeah, exactly. What caught my attention was how hostile the media has become to men. For example, one of the ones that really caught my eye was an article in the Washington Post titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really? In a mainstream publication? Or the Huffington Post had an editor who tweeted out hashtag kill all men and then said it was a joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy t-shirts that say so many men, so little ammunition. And there are books with titles that are very blunt, like I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? So what really was tragic, though, is when I saw even men attacking their own sex. A fairly well-known book author actually wrote, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one you may have seen because it was more recent, so it's not even in the book, but it was in the news where the producer of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So no wonder men feel as if the culture is hostile to them today. I do quote a psychotherapist who writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, especially younger men. Younger men are coming in feeling depressed, demoralized, and beaten down because they feel like they feel emasculated, is how she put it, because they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. A 2020 survey here in America found that almost half of American men agree with the statement, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. So whether you agree with that or not, that's a lot of people who think that men are getting a bad deal today. And so that's why I think we need to pay attention to it. I think it's about time that we had some compassion on men and the negative social pressure that they're under today. And even in the church. I teach at a Christian university, Houston Christian. And when I told my class that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I thought, okay, that's why I have to write this book. I want to find a way to help men, to affirm and support men.
I think we need to start at this basic idea. From a biblical view, there is a difference between male and female. We're both equally made in the image of God. Both male and female have equal dignity, equal value, equal worth. But there are clear biological differences between male and female, physiological differences as well. And men they do have more testosterone. They do have greater upper body strength. They are wired, if you will, generally differently than women. Do you think that there's something else going on here where we live in an age of expressive individualism, where people are told that they can determine their own sex, their own gender? Do you think that there's something related to that that would say that because you're male, that you're built biologically and physiologically different, trying to do away with that? Is this at play here as well?
Well, yeah, and that's covering a lot of ground. On the one hand, I did find that I had to put this right at the beginning of my book, because people would say, "Well, what do you think is the difference between men and women then?" And I would have to say, well, let's just start with the biology. It's clear, like you said, men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast twitch muscles, which means they can react more quickly. Um, because of testosterone, they are more aggressive in general, more risk taking. And we do have to affirm that as a baseline of the creative givens. This is how God made men. And we have to at least start with, we have to acknowledge that what God creates is good. And therefore, we have to acknowledge that these differences are good. I think some of the reason for feminism is that many people fear that if you acknowledge differences, somebody's going to be less than. And let's face it, that does happen. It's just normal. It's human that when we make a distinction, we often think one is better and one's worse. And so historically, it has in fact been true that feminine characteristics have been denigrated as, weak and inferior. And so at the same time we affirm men, we do have to make sure we're standing against feminism by saying, hey, we can acknowledge what's good about women too. And again, start with the basic biology. Women's superpower is that they can have children. And that spills over into their psychology as well, because to take care of an infant requires a certain quality of character. You have to be willing to be interrupted no matter what you're doing, right? Because when a child, when an infant is in distress, you don't, shove them aside and say, wait, I'm not done yet. You don't reason with them. You don't punish them. You meet their distress immediately. And you have to be very sensitive to nonverbal cues because they're not talking yet. And you have to be very sensitive to threats in the environment. So women become mama bears. And so I think we have to be very careful that we acknowledge the differences, but we don't ever let it become, a better or worse situation, that we're always affirming what's good about God's created order and God's design for men and women.
Hi, Richard Nelson here. There's got to be a better way to engage politics. That's why I wrote a new book focusing on how Christians can lead the way. It's called Christianity and Politics, a memoir of spiritual formation and field guide for Christians in the public arena. This is a refreshing perspective on how believers can engage the political realm, and it's available for pre-order on Amazon today. So please check it out. I think you're going to find it helpful. Nancy, Christianity in particular is being attacked today by those who say it is misogynistic, patriarchal, that it hurts women, demeans women. In some cases, I guess you could find examples that would support that. But the biblical view, the biblical record does not say that, does not teach that. In fact, you make the case in your book that the Christian view of gender and marriage is a good for both men and women. You go on to say that, for example, devout Christian men have the lowest rates of divorce and the lowest rates of domestic violence of any other group that is surveyed out there. 73% of wives who hold conservative gender roles and attend church regularly are happier in their marriage and have higher quality marriages. And yet Christianity is being attacked as being part of the problem. How do you respond to that?
Well, yes, this is, in the media narrative, certainly Christian men, especially theologically conservative Christian men, are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. I'll give you just one example. I have lots of them in my book. They were easy to find. But the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, the co-founder said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. Well, that's an empirical claim. Is it true that holding to some sort of headship or authority in the home turns men into these overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs? Well, so the social scientists were listening to these charges and saying, "Where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data?" And so they went out and did the studies. I quote about a dozen studies in my book by psychologists and sociologists. And to my own surprise, I didn't expect this myself. But yes, you were right. Evangelical Christian men test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And the first question I always get is, well, what do their wives say? If the wife is sitting right next to her husband, of course she said that. No, they do interview the wives separately. So what they're saying is that the wives report the highest level of happiness in their marriage. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children than secular men, 3.5 hours more per week. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And then, as you said, the most surprising thing is they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. And so the quote that you gave, the 73%, that's from Brad Wilcox. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. He did the largest study. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. And so that number that you quoted is actually from a New York Times article in which he said it turns out that 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And by the way, he then turns to his secular colleagues, because sociology does tend to be a more secularized field. And he says academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular, because Protestant evangelical men test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is not a pep talk from some religious leader, right? This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings that we should be very confident about, well, first bringing into our churches, because it's not there yet. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this, so we need to bring it into our churches. And we should also be confident bringing it into the public square to counter the negative secular narrative that's in the media today.
Very good. Nancy, your book really digs deep into history. You go back church history, you look at American history. And one of the things you point to, a period of history that has hurt the home and hurt marriages and strong families, is the time of industrialization. And that happened in this country between 1750 to 1850. And you say that it took a toll on manhood, is it wrested men from their homes where he and his wife worked side by side. And then also you go on to say that the market economy that we're in today and that we've been in since colonial days, that affects how men relate to their families. So industrialization, I mean, that's something nobody was going to stop that unless you become Amish or Mennonite. Where do men go? I mean, is your solution for men to go? And I know this is a lot here, but how do we, as Christian men who care about strong families and we care about healthy marriages, how do we, taking what you shared in your book, that industrialization and taking man out of the home and this a man and woman, a husband and wife working side by side, is that something you're saying that we should go back to in order to have stronger families and stronger marriages?
I got into it because I wanted to explain where the negative view of masculinity came from, because most people think 1960s, second wave feminism, and I found I had to go much further back. Like you say, the Industrial Revolution was a huge change, because before that, men and women worked side by side on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so there was an interrelationship between husband and wife, an interdependence that was lost with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And as a result, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, men were not working alongside their family members, right? People they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's a very different work environment. And this is when you see the literature change, not in the 1960s, more like the 1860s. You start to see the literature change in terms of people saying that men were losing the caretaking ethos that they'd had in an earlier age, that even secular historians say that in the colonial era, the ideal for manhood was duty to God and man. So very duty and service driven. Well, people began to complain that men working as individuals in the industrialized workplace tend to be focused much more on their individual achievement, individual accomplishment, career success. I was surprised when I read the literature of the day how often they complained that men were turning their career into an idol. That was the word frequently used. Um, and so that is when, if you want to know when the literature changed and when did men start being described negatively, you have to go all the way back to there. And that does, of course, give a sense of what a solution might be. Is there a way that we can, even in an industrial world, tweak the edges to allow men to have more time with their family? And I give lots of stories. Right now, it's at the anecdotal level, right? So I went out, interviewed a lot of people who'd found ways to work, either from home or at least part time from home, or start their own business. I found a lot of people who are working on this, and the pandemic was a game changer. This is not in the book because it's more recent, but Harvard University did a study, and they said 65% of fathers said that during the pandemic they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. And so fathers want to be involved with their kids. 70 in another survey, 70% of fathers said they would prefer more time with their children, even if it meant a reduced salary. And ironically, in a totally different study, the same number, 70% of wives said they would prefer their husbands to have more time at home, even if it meant a lower salary. So millennials consistently say in surveys they really want a better balance. Women do want a chance to work in the workplace, and use the skills that they've developed, especially if they've gone through higher education. But they want to be home too because they want to be with the kids. Fathers want a better balance too. What we don't have yet is the structures that really make that possible. But I did, in my book, I looked at CEOs who acknowledged again that during the pandemic, their ideas changed. I quote one CEO who said, before the pandemic, we were very suspicious of any sort of remote work, right? They just thought people would slough off. He said, this is a direct quote, the pandemic completely exploded those fears. We did not see any drop in productivity. So I think we're at a point now where we can make a better case. And I'm not saying everybody should, try to work more from home. I'm interested in children. I'm interested in children. So I'm talking about parents in particular, having a more flexible work style when they're raising young children.
Have you ever wondered why America is the most prosperous nation in history? We've certainly been blessed, but we take the conditions for prosperity for granted. That's why CPC is hosting the Toward a Better Bluegrass Conference. We've invited some of the top thinkers and leaders to speak about the sources of our economic strength. Biblical principles, America's founding framework, and individual capacity are a few issues that we'll be addressing. So please join us on October the 18th in Lexington. And for more information, go to our website, commonwealthpolicycenter.org. And we look forward to seeing you there. If you're just joining us, you're tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson here with Professor Nancy Pearcey, and we're talking about her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And I said new book, it came out last year. Fascinating book, though. Nancy, you talked about another important development in our history as to affecting the idea of masculinity, and it's the scientific revolution. And you said that eventually led to thinking that said that the only reliable form of knowledge is what can be known by science, empirically verifiable facts, whereas moral and spiritual truths don't qualify since they cannot be tested. And morals and spiritual truths were reduced to personal preferences and redefined as private feelings. Therefore, morality was relegated to the sphere of family, church, and personal relationships, and did not have a role in the public sphere. So were you saying that this somehow hurt the idea of masculinity?
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, moral and spiritual truths can be tested, just not empirically. Just want to throw that in there because I think they can be tested. Um, but yes, here's how it affected masculinity. At the same time that the industrial revolution was taking men out of the home, the scientific revolution was persuading many people that empirical knowledge was the only form of knowledge, and that therefore moral values don't belong in the public realm. Right? This was also part of the Industrial Revolution. We began to have very large public institutions like the state, industry, business, financial institutions, banks, universities, and so on. And many people began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by quote unquote scientific principles. And, we shouldn't worry about morality. And that's why morality then gets pushed over into the private sphere. Well, what does that mean? That means that men are the ones at that time getting that secularized education, working in that secularized work environment. And so men did, historically, they became secular in their outlook earlier than women did. So it had a huge impact on their character because, of course, then they were less committed to a Christian view of morality, to a Christian view of what manhood is, what God's design is for men. And in fact, what took its place, by the way, I go through several stages of the secularization of the masculine script, but my favorite stage was the rise of Darwinian evolution. And most people are surprised because they think, wait, that's about science. It had an enormous impact on men because by then, if science was the truth, well, what was science saying? Social Darwinists were saying that the men who won out on top in the struggle for survival would be brutal, savage, barbarian, and predatory. So instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they urged men to live down to what they called the beast within. And so this is part of our heritage. I mean, if you want to trace where the Andrew Tate phenomenon comes from, fast cars, fast women, fast money, it has deep intellectual roots in social Darwinism.
Nancy, I'm glad that you brought up Darwinianism because Darwin also had a very low view of women. He believed that they were subservient to men, less capable, less in many categories. And I'm fascinated that so many scientists who would consider themselves enlightened can, I guess, maybe parse out. They believe in Darwinian evolution, and then they want to somehow get rid of his low view of women. But I would say that is. That's just part of the whole package. This is the survival of the fittest, right? They're those who are strongest, those who are the fittest. They're going to make it. And look, physically, that is the way it works in the animal kingdom. But we're not merely animals, are we?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, yes, Darwin himself specifically argued that women were intellectually inferior in every way. And by the way, he acknowledged that they are emotionally more sympathetic and more caring and more compassionate. But then he said, "But those are the traits of the lower animals." So even in the even the area where he said women were superior, they were actually that was a sign of their lower. They were on a lower rung of the evolutionary ladder. So yeah, it's important, I think, especially in our day where science is still held up to a large extent as the ultimate truth. By the way, Darwin was also a racist. He did believe that the other races were less evolved. I mean, if you accept evolution, it's not unusual to think, well, maybe different cultures different ethnic groups are at different stages of evolution. That was a logical conclusion, and he did conclude that. So people defending Darwin will say, well, he was against slavery. That's true, but not because he thought other races were equal. He still thought that they were on a lower rung of the evolutionary ladder. And you're right. By the way, Darwin's statue has been removed. I think it's from the British Museum of Natural History, because finally people are starting to say, well, Darwin had some things wrong. It was the racism. It was because of the racism that they removed his statue. So that might be a good sign that people are starting to see that Darwinism has some problems with it, not to mention some of the scientific problems.
Very good. Nancy, you make several observations in your book about shifting theology in the church. You start out by, at one point, you make you point out Alexis de Tocqueville. When he came to the United States in 1830, he observed that wives were held in high regard by their husbands. Good men were viewed as good fathers who channeled their strength to protect and provide for their household and their community. There was a theological underpinning to this, but this shifted this idea of biblical masculinity and what was viewed as healthy manhood. That shifted over the course of the 19th century, so that by the end of the 19th century, by the way, a majority of churchgoers were women. It was 3 out of every 4 attendees in churches in this country were women. I was shocked to see that figure. So there had been theological shifts, major changes in the teaching of the role of men and healthy masculinity. So at what point can we point to was there a certain time or a certain event where we lost solid biblical theology on masculinity and healthy relationships between men and women and men in culture?
Yes, and I'm going to piggyback off what you said earlier when you said that the concept of morality was privatized, and people said, "Let's kick morality out of the public square." Well, if it's not cultivated in the public square, where will it go? It'll go to the private sphere, and who will do the cultivating? Well, women, because of course women were mostly at home back then. And this is when the double standard began, where people began to say that women were more naturally moral, more naturally spiritual. Men were just more naturally prone to sin and vice and lust and temptation. And so it was part of the denigration of the male character. But I want you to see how new this was. People think that double standard's been there forever. No, it happened in the 19th century. That was completely new, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. People had thought that men were morally superior. Their reasoning went like this: the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and men were thought to be more rational, and therefore men were thought to be more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue, the root of the word vir, is Latin for man. So virtue had overtones of manly strength and honor. And so this was completely new in the 19th century when American culture turned to women and said, well, you guys now are the morally superior sex, and it's your job to hold men in check. And so women were, in a sense, said, men are going to drink and sleep around and go to prostitutes, and it's up to women to impose a moral standard. Well, what was happening then? They were letting men off the hook. So this is another aspect of the culture expecting less and less of men and allowing a more negative view of masculinity to take hold. And again, how do we counter that? Well, we have to counter that double standard. Men should be held to the same standard that women are. Men are made in God's image. They should be just as spiritual, just as moral, as any woman. The very fact that the Christian church acquiesced in this is a sign of weakness. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something the church needs to address in holding men to the same standard. And by the way, just to let you know how contemporary this is, I was interviewed on a podcast with a young couple, the young Christian couple recently married. So I turned the tables and asked them. I said, well, what do you think? Is the double standard still there in the Christian church? And they said, absolutely. In the dating scene, absolutely. You just expect that men have this lust that's just boiling under the surface and it's about to burst out, and it's up to women to hold them in check with their dress, with their behavior, with their language. And so, in a sense, women are still held morally responsible for men's behavior. And that's a real failing on the church. We need to have higher standards for men.
That's good. We're both equally made in the image of God, but we're both, men and women are equally sinners, right? Neither one is better than the other. Both responsible, both image bearers, and the burden should not be on males or females when it comes to that. You do point out that women led various reform movements in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Of course, men were involved with many of the social ills, whether it was domestic abuse, alcohol abuse. Women were involved, very much involved with the abolition movement. Um, in women, this was fascinating too, Nancy. You point out that many of them were involved with building up their societies or culture building. They established parks, libraries, they started orphanages, they worked for prison reform. Women were very culturally engaged, took the lead. In the past, it was men who were taking the lead. Or perhaps men and women who were taking the lead, but now it was just significantly women who were very much involved with influencing and shaping culture in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Probably the best example is the prohibition movement to get rid of alcohol. So why was this? Was this just the women saw it was happening to their husbands or to the men, or is this an extension of them being the morally superior, or that idea that they were morally superior and that they had to tame the men, so they just naturally got out there and engaged?
Yeah, it was both. On the one hand, yes, it's a sign of society holding women accountable to be the moral guardians of society. And so women said, well, we can't be the moral guardians of society if we're just at home. We have to go out into the public realm, because that's where we cannot keep evil out of the home, evil and vice out of the home. You can't hermetically, you can't hermetically seal off the home. You can tell I have a theology background, hermeneutically. You can't hermetically seal the home. And so, for example, if men are going to prostitutes, they bring the diseases back home and infect their wives. That was one of their common arguments. So on the one hand, yes, it's an expectation that women are the moral guardians of society. And they said, we've got to go out into the public realm to do that. But it was also part of what we just said about women. If women are being held accountable to be the moral guardians, well, what about men? It means that men are being held to a lower standard. And let's go back to fatherhood. That was influenced also by the Industrial Revolution. If men are out of the home, what happens to men as fathers? Well, they're less connected to their children. They don't know what their children are thinking all day. They're not there as a moral and spiritual guidance all through the day. This was totally new. We're so used to it that we don't realize at the time it was experienced as shocking, as traumatic. You see articles written at the time saying, the greatest sorrow of our day is that fathers are out of the home. They're neglecting their children. The head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union wrote an article in which she said, the greatest social problem today is fatherlessness. We don't think of it. They were technically in the home, but they were out of the home all day. And here's how she put it. The father is supposed to be the exemplar of the divine, right? The God, the Father. And yet the exemplar of the divine is gone from home from Sunday to Sunday. They didn't have Saturdays off yet, but, the father's out of the home all week. And so how do we have, the exemplar, the divine, as a working influence in the home when he's not there all day? Well, even the psychologists of the day said, boys are misbehaving. Boys, but the father's not there. The leading psychologist of the day said, never in American history has the American boy been so wild and so half-orphaned. I love that phrase. They're half-orphaned because their fathers are not really there to raise them anymore. Well, what happened when they grew up? If they were becoming more wild and misbehaving and rowdy, rule breaking, that became sort of the bad boy image. They brought that bad boy image with them. And so the 19th century saw a huge increase in crime, in gang activity, in drinking, in prostitution, fighting in the streets. Sometimes a single fact can help crystallize it. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there's a reason there was a temperance movement. So on the one hand, men's behavior was growing worse because they were not being raised by their fathers anymore. And so, and then women sort of stepped in to say, what can we do to help this? And you're right, there were men as part of these reform movements. By the way, there were so many reform movements that historians call them collectively the benevolent empire, just to give us a sense of how many there were. But people who resisted the reform movements like to be able to point out that many of them, here's how they would put it, they're run by women and the clergy. That's how they often dismissed them. Who's trying to impose these reforms on us? Women and the clergy. So even at the time, it was acknowledged that at least the foot soldiers, the people really running these organizations, reform movements, it was mostly women. And I do, in the book, I do talk about some of the impact of that as well, because men were then put on the defensive. They were being treated as a villain, and they got tired of that. And so in the late 19th, early 20th century, you see a shift where men began saying, well, this is just our nature. We're just naturally, more wild, more lustful, more prone to temptation, more prone to sin and vice. And that's just what the masculine character is. That's what we're up against today in the secular world. That is currently the secular script. And it's not just Andrew Tate. There's another influencer who he was heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. His name is Myron Gaines, and his tagline is, I help men transform from simps into pimps. And he's got quite a following now, too. So all that, it was Christian men who put me onto Myron Gaines. So they're aware of these secular influences. And that's what we need to realize. One of my graduate students just wrote me an email saying, I teach at a high school now, and all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using quotes from Andrew Tate in the yearbook. So I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. So if we're not giving them an inspiring, biblical, healthy view of masculinity, they are going to reach out to these online influencers.
Nancy, there is a war on the idea of masculinity today, and men are falling behind. I'm thinking of that early statement you made by one of the students in one of your classes, who said, "What masculinity?" Young men have not had fathers to model masculinity for them. Popular culture is deriding this idea, belittling masculinity. And men are falling behind today in areas of education, employment, health, even their life expectancy, you point out in your book. And I want to look at education, this particular area. You say in your book that the classroom is set up to reward girls. There are 4 times the number of scholarships available for women compared to men. Only 40% of men today are pursuing higher education today. 60% of higher ed 4-year programs are women. 60% are women, 40% are men. Many college campuses have women's studies programs where they deconstruct male power. Is there a call to change the curriculum in higher ed, or to change public policy where there's this institutionalized, if you will, beating up of males?
Yeah, well, to agree with you for starters, yes, men and boys are falling behind. It starts in kindergarten. Boys don't have the same fine motor control that girls have, so they can't use the scissors as well. So already in kindergarten, they feel like they're falling behind. And they do stay behind all through elementary school, high school. As you noted, I mean, this was a surprise to me that universities are now 60% female, 40% male, and even graduate schools and professional schools like law and medicine now are more female than male. And then when they do graduate, like you said, they are falling behind in things like life expectancy. More men than women, addicted to drugs and alcohol, homeless, mental illness, crime, most obviously, 90% of men, prison inmates are men, which I think you said at the beginning of the program. So there have been a plethora of books that have come out with titles like The War Against Boys and Why Boys Fail and The Trouble with Boys. And people have been trying to draw attention to it. But the woman who wrote The War Against Boys, which was the first book on the subject, is Christina Hoff Sommers. And she identifies herself as a feminist. But she also says that every time she proposed a program to help boys, it was feminist groups that shot it down. It's as if it's if you help boys, you're not going to help girls, which of course is not true. You can help both. And the good news is, let me tell you about the most recent book. It's called Of Boys and Men. And it's the first book actually written by a bona fide liberal. This has gotten coded as a conservative issue, caring about boys. So Richard Reeves, who was at the Brookings Institution, wrote Of Boys and Men, and he was warned not to write it. Don't touch this topic, it'll ruin your career. Because again, it's been coded as conservative, but he wrote the book anyway. And that's a good sign. That means it's getting out of the conservative ghetto. It's now becoming acceptable for liberal people to acknowledge that boys have a problem, that we need to have special programs for boys. They do learn differently from girls. They often have a different cognitive style. And he was so convinced of it that he actually left the Brookings Institution and started his own organization to pursue research in this study. I think I don't remember the name of it, but it's something like, Institute for Boys and Men. But you can look it up. The book is Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, Reeves. So this is the best news yet, is that actually it's becoming acceptable on a wider level to acknowledge that boys have a problem, and to acknowledge that it's time to have compassion on boys and men, and to have special programs to help them succeed and to do well.
Nancy, you talk about getting back to some of the things that have happened in American churches where there has been a feminization, if you will, of Christianity. There has been pushback against that, where there have been attempts to masculinize, is that a word? Christianity. Billy Sunday was one example who tried to bring back the masculine traits. But you say in your book that Christianity really doesn't suppress masculinity. In fact, you go on to say that it does not suppress men's thirst for risk and adventure, but redirects it to eternal goals. That men should use masculine traits to fight evil, overcome sin, and protect those they love, and to strategize how to advance biblical truth in the world. When I read that paragraph, I was excited. I'm like, you know what? If Christianity is true, it's true for men and women, and it's true for both of us in our callings that God has put before us. It is deeply biblical to be masculine. It's deeply biblical to be feminine. But this whole idea of risk and adventure is something I resonated with. I started this public policy group a dozen years ago not because I'm into risk and adventure, but I wanted to advance biblical truth. And actually, to be honest, I do like adventure, but I wanted to see a biblical vision for a healthy and flourishing culture to go forward. There was a void here in Kentucky, and this statement here is something I just really resonated with. Can you expand on that, though? How is this a message maybe that pastors need to give in their churches, a biblical vision for manhood or a biblical vision for men, I don't know, in the workplace or in the culture? Is this a call for pastors to speak on this?
Yeah, it really is, because like I said earlier, this material, the sociological studies on Christian men is not in the churches yet. I had to go digging in academic journals. If you read my endnotes, they're all academic journals. And so here's what happens in the church. I had a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry at a very large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so my book is all about, let's stop the scolding. Let's bring this positive data. And again, it's objective research that shows that theologically conservative Christian men actually do test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. And another sign of why we need this is that when my book came out, this has been the most controversial book I've written. And that surprised me because my previous book, Love Thy Body, dealt with abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism. But when this book came out, literally the day after it came out, I got viciously attacked by hordes on Twitter. And it turns out that they were mostly Christian egalitarians who said, if your book is supporting complementarian men, and that's evil, bad, and dangerous. Well, the irony is, I don't actually deal with the debate between egalitarian and complementarian. And the reason I don't, I mean, I acknowledge the debate, but I show that sociologists have shown that it doesn't seem to matter that much. You know, you can have a Christian character as a man, whatever your gender theory is. And I quote two experts on the subject. One is the sociologist I mentioned earlier, Brad Wilcox. And he says, you know, from his studies, a husband's gender theory doesn't seem to make much difference in how he treats his wife. And the second one was a psychologist. He's considered the top marriage psychologist in the nation, John Gottman. He has a Jewish background. And he said, I have couples coming into my practice. Some of them are very complementarian who think the man should be in charge, and some of them are very egalitarian. And he said, here's how he put it. What I found is that emotionally intelligent husbands, that's his phrase, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to show respect and honor to your wife. And so I quote my two experts and I say, on a practical level, this does not seem to make much difference. And then I got attacked because I said that. I got attacked by people saying you're being too nice to conservative Christian men. Well, that shows you a little bit what we're up against even in the church. If you bring a message like my book that says, I'm sorry, but the data is clear. I'm not giving you my opinion. The research is very clear that theologically conservative Christian men test out as very good husbands and fathers. The best, in fact, you know, on all these traits, how they treat their wives, how they treat their children, their level of abuse, and so on. So that gives you some sense. By the way, after the egalitarians stopped attacking me, then the complementarians attacked me too, because they said I wasn't strong enough in defending complementarian, even though I defended theologically conservative men. Anyway, so that just shows you what a trigger this issue is in the church. And so, yes, we need to get this message into the church.
Nancy, I think that goes to, it speaks to the day and age that we're in where people tend to react. Or if you're not in 100% agreement or totally fortifying a particular argument, people might call you into question and attack you like they did here. I will say this. Here's a statement you said about biblical authority in the home. You said that when authority in the home is exercised biblically, it is not oppressive, but liberating. It enables us to expand our capacities by coordinating with each other. And you get into the idea of essentially servant leadership. I think you're referring to men in the home. Men are criticized for being abusive or not being sensitive to their wives. But you're getting to the idea really of servant leadership, caring for their wives, loving their wives well, being sensitive to their needs. And I think the statistics show, like you were pointing out, that these are healthier marriages and they're happier families as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just have a negative view of authority per se. And, so I use the example of I play the violin, and the orchestra would not function without a conductor, and everyone has to follow the conductor. So authority, that's why I say it can be liberating. I can't play a Beethoven symphony on my own, but if I follow the direction of a conductor, I can coordinate with others and play something that I could never do on my own. So that's what I mean when I say that it's liberating. I do have to put a footnote in here that the research on evangelical men did show that nominal Christian men break the mold. So it might be good to put that in as a qualification. So nominal, my students don't know what that means. So I say NOM is Latin for name. So nominal means in name only. So these are men who in a survey like this might check the Baptist box, for example, but who attend church rarely, if at all. And they actually do test out with all the negative stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, even higher than secular men, 20% higher. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. And so Brad Wilcox, who I've quoted twice now, wrote an article in Christianity Today where he said, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. So it's very important that, in the first of all, we have to realize that a lot of the negative media stereotypes are coming from the nominal men. And number two, our churches have to realize what they're up against. How can they do a better job of affirming and supporting the men who are doing well, who are authentic in their faith, who attend church regularly? And on the other hand, how can they reach out to these nominals who are at the fringes and who are taking words like headship and submission, but they don't know the biblical meaning. And so they're infusing those words with secular meaning. So that's one reason we need to know the secular script, because otherwise, our men and our boys will be absorbing the secular script with no critical grid in place. And so that's what we need to do, is help set up a critical grid so that they recognize when non-biblical views of masculinity are coming into the church.
Very good. Nancy, we're going to wrap this up, but I want to, as we've talked about, there are several consequences of demeaning true manhood. But one of the consequences of belittling manhood, you say in your book, is that the danger and consequence of emasculating men is that women will be left with boys who have no incentive to mature or honor their commitments. How do we change course? And we might need to do an entirely separate program on this, but how do we change course? Manhood has a very negative view. Men have been beaten down. Men are suffering today. I think we've lost a solid theological moorings when it comes to manhood. But how do we change course? Is there a particular place we need to begin?
Well, that's kind of the big question, right? About what is a biblical view of manhood, and how do we have a more positive understanding of the biblical view. A lot of boys are just dropping out, right? They're dropping out of dating. They're not even trying to form relationships anymore. They're spending their time, the classic image of the 23-year-old who's in his mother's basement playing video games is a little bit too true. I thought maybe I would tell you how a liberal person changed, because sometimes it's fun to see how a Christian view becomes so compelling that it even persuades a liberal. There's a liberal woman who she's a journalist, and she's British, so she used to write for the New Statesman, which is a very left-leaning publication. And she's come out with a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And what happened is she began to work at a rape crisis center. And that finally persuaded her that as a culture, we have to acknowledge the differences between men and women. For the woman's sake, that's why it can sell, right? If you frame it for the women's, but nonetheless, it is true. Her point was, if you're in a date, if you're at a party and you're with a guy, and you're both half drunk, you need to get out of there, because you're at risk. He's bigger, he's stronger, and you're the one who's at risk. She worked at a rape crisis center. And so that was the beginning of her change. She started to acknowledge the differences between men and women. And from there, she went to, well, men's traits are intrinsically good, and marriage is intrinsically good, and morality is actually pretty good. I saw her recently in a podcast where a secular interviewer was like asking her, well, what should you do, in terms of dating and sex? That question was, when do you have sex? And she said, well, not until you're married. And he was like, what? You've got to be joking. And she held up her hand like this with her wedding ring on it. And she said, you don't want to have sex with a man until you're pretty sure he's going to stick around and help take care of any children that result. And this ring is a pretty good guarantee. It's amazing to watch somebody who is very leftist move over into, and by the way, I hear through mutual friends that she is checking out churches now. So read the book if you want to, for a fun example of a very liberal person who's come to a conservative and perhaps even Christian perspective on all of these issues of sex and gender and dating and marriage. I mean, you won't learn anything new because she's just discovering what we already know as Christians. It's just fun to watch a secular person discover that truth.
That's good. That's a good note to close on. Professor Nancy Pearcey, her book is called The Toxic War on Masculinity. Nancy, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters. Until next time, may God bless you.